Hello and welcome to Smith and Sheridan on Biotech, podcast about the science and business of biotechnology, presented by myself, Cormac Sheridan.
And me, Andy Smith. Hello, Cormac. Hello, everyone.
Hello, Andy. How are you?
Fine, thanks.
Today we're going to talk about vaccines. You, I think, were piqued by a particular announcement made by Pfizer recently, which had knock-on effects on its partner BioNTech, basically owing, I think, to trimming investor expectations around their vaccine sales, the likely totals for this year. What specifically was the piece of news?
Yeah, it wasn't just vaccine sales, but it also was the Paxlovid, the antiviral. But in any case, it's products to treat COVID-19. They got the world through the pandemic, administered billions of doses to people, saved an awful amount of death and disease. And yet, since the pandemic, their share price has come off, along with many other companies who were developing products for the pandemic. And as stockpiles increased, doses were administered, and we might touch on a subject called vaccine hesitancy seemed to rise after the pandemic. Then since that time, companies who have had products on the market, be it diagnostics, antivirals, vaccines, have been adjusting down their forecast sales and their actual sales from the peak, obviously, the peak time during the pandemic. It sort of seems we're in a nowhere land after the pandemic. You and I had a discussion beforehand where we sort of had the running title of where have all the vaccines gone? Well, they've gone into people's arms, right? And it was thank you very much, but we don't need you anymore. That's how it feels at the moment.
But yeah, and I mean, just for people, I did check the share prices of some of the key companies, not something I do on a regular basis, but on the year-to-date performance of the stocks of BioNTech, they're down 37%, Pfizer's down 39%, Moderna's down even higher at 54%, and Novavax is down 38%. They weren't quite as big a player, but they also had quite an important vaccine product as well. But arguably, is this not as it should be? They produced these products, they sold them in vast quantities, and the numbers are staggering. Pfizer's sales of both vaccine and anti-COVID drug treatments over the 3 years, 21 to 2023, including sort of their forecasted revenues for this year, comes to $115 billion. BioNTech, just over 40 billion euros. Moderna, just over 43 billion euros. And the numbers take account of guidance that they've issued to investors for 2023. Obviously, the year isn't out. They've been staggering amounts of money. Their investors have been staggering amounts of money. And humanity certainly has benefited hugely. But it was never going to go on forever. And they all received this, if I can use a slightly medical term, a bolus of cash, a big lump of cash that's coursing through their money circulatory systems, and they can do things with it. I mean, Pfizer has spent, about $40 billion acquiring
Seattle Genetics, yeah.
Seattle Genetics, yeah. So they have a lot of cash, they have a lot of possibilities, and the share price is always going to be a multiple of the profits. The profits are falling because this whole phenomenon has worked its way through, and so yes, the share price is down, but they have a lot of cash, and I presume as well the investors are probably going to get some of that cash in dividends over the next few years. So an investor, they can't really expect the party to go on forever, can they?
Well, it also illustrates the inefficiency of the stock market, Cormac, because a company's stock price is meant to reflect its future value generation, and to some extent, whatever's on the balance sheet, and you were talking about cash today, but that's usually a small part of the valuation. So where you have a once in a generation event like the pandemic that comes along and companies develop products and they sell them and they generate sales, people naturally assume that will continue for a while. It won't just be a one season. And they were correct, right? It wasn't just a one season pandemic. It was over a number of years. But then there's the aspect of, perhaps it will go on for a bit longer. And there are still people getting COVID-19 vaccines today. And there probably will be high-risk people getting them next year. But it's nowhere near as much. The other aspect of certainly Pfizer's share price, BioNTech's, and to some extent Moderna's, is that there may be another pandemic, right? So if you want an insurance policy of a company that will do well in a pandemic, it's a company that did well in the last pandemic.
And it's interesting just on that point, though, about the sort of the long tail of their COVID product sales. The numbers they're doing or forecast to be doing this year are actually very substantial.
Yeah, there are companies that would die for those sort of revenues.
Yes, yes.
And yet Pfizer is dying because it's only got those sort of revenues, or its share price is dying.
And just for people who haven't checked, I mean, Pfizer is forecasting $13.5 billion in sales of its vaccine and another 8 billion of its Paxlovid treatment.
Yeah.
I mean, that's a mega blockbuster drug. BioNTech is forecasting 5 billion euros in sales, and Moderna is forecasting between $6 and $8 billion in vaccine sales. These are big, big numbers.
And it's also an interesting aspect of the business model of vaccines per se, because you don't need people to get an infection. You don't need an ongoing pandemic to have vaccine sales. And we saw this 10, 20 years ago with companies like Acambis that had contracts to supply the smallpox vaccine. There wasn't any smallpox in the world at the time, but there were fears after September the 11th of bioterrorism. So they got hundreds of millions of dollars in terms of contracts to supply a stockpile. And that may be the next thing if the mRNA vaccines or the COVID vaccines in general could be made to be more stable, there might be some revenues there in stockpiling over longer periods. But that's the difference between drugs and vaccines is, well, there are a number of differences. Firstly, the vaccines are given to healthy people without disease, and the clinical studies are different because you look at different things. But also, you don't need people to have that disease in order to sell vaccines, and they're commercialized in quite different ways. Again, it's largely a tender market, more like biosimilars in Europe, at least, than drug contracting for branded drugs, even more so, even like generic drugs.
As we look at the aftermath, and it's probably wrong to say we're in the aftermath of the pandemic, but I guess the virus is sort of transitioning to being endemic now in the human population. It's with us and will continue to be with us. And as you say, it will affect vulnerable people in very serious ways, causing both death and serious disease. And obviously, we cannot also forget about the significant percentage of people who are suffering from long COVID over periods of time that do vary, but some people have dreadfully bad experiences in the months and maybe even years that follow infection. So this is going to remain with us, and it will be in and of itself a significant, large niche. I mean, it's still the largest selling vaccine by miles. I haven't looked at the numbers for flu recently, but they're nothing like this. And yet, as well, you mentioned vaccine hesitancy. I'm not particularly interested hugely in discussing anti-vaxxer sentiment because it's been done to death, and it's almost like a religious belief system rather than anything that's founded in rationality. I think you as well mentioned vaccine fatigue. And I've seen that with people whom I know myself, who are just like, I'm not getting another booster. I've had 3 of them, and that's enough now. And, you know, the last time I got COVID, it was nothing, and I'm not having it anymore. And it's not necessarily, I mean, it's not an anti-vaccine. Well, I suppose there's a level of ambiguity there. But from a sort of human health perspective, in terms of when one is taking responsibility for one's own health and making decisions about one's own health, it's not necessarily massively reckless behavior. I know at a systems or population level, maybe that's not a wise thing to say. I'm sure medics would utterly disagree with me. So I'm not going to hang my hat on that one particularly, but I can see this is how people are responding. And it must be said that, unfortunately, the performance of the vaccines has been somewhat disappointing from the point of view of the duration of the immunity that is obtained. And obviously, the early data coming through, particularly from Israel, I think, who had the first efficacy studies coming through from the field. And there was a real hope initially that you would also have sterilizing immunity as well as protection against severe disease. Now, that didn't pan out to be the case as the vaccine evolved to evade both stresses from the immune system caused by human host responses and by vaccine-induced responses. The sterilizing immunity piece disappeared practically, but the protection against severe disease was substantial very meaningful and, let's say it, rather magnificent, actually.
Mm.
But I think people feel that they have banked that protection. They have it, whether it's a combination of what they've had. I mean, because immunological memory is real, and they feel they've banked it, and they feel that yet another booster, unless they are in a particular high-risk group, isn't going to give them a whole lot.
Yeah, there are lots of facets to that. And I think you're right in saying vaccine fatigue, more than vaccine hesitancy, more than whatever social media tells you you should or shouldn't do with vaccines, is a level of gradation. But yes, we're in many decades or almost 100 years of vaccinations that started with smallpox vaccinations with Jenner. And we were really lucky in those days. Well, those people who rely were really lucky in those days, because that vaccination gives lifetime immunity. Because smallpox is a big virus, one of the most advanced viruses. So it takes a lot for it to chop and change its DNA and its structure and things. So it's reasonably conserved. So one vaccine will survive and give people immunity over many decades or many generations, in fact, if you give it to a number of people. But that's actually quite rare. There are a few other vaccines, the hepatitis B vaccine and the yellow fever vaccine are those unusual ones and the yellow fever vaccine is unusual because it's a live attenuated virus rather than a component virus or an mRNA virus like the Covid-19 vaccines. But they're rare because they give you lifetime immunity. Most others, even like mumps, measles, rubellas, or there's been some discussion about shingles vaccines that you can get chickenpox earlier in life, but it doesn't give you lifetime immunity. So you get shingles later on. There's a shingles vaccine that GSK produced. So there are not that many vaccines that give you lifetime immunity. And that's why we continue to have, and no one ever criticized annual influenza virus vaccines. But the other aspect is that there are certain viruses that chop and change their DNA and their proteins that decorate their surface in order to evade last year's immune response or last season's immune response. Influenza is one of those, and COVID is another, which is exacerbated, certainly in COVID's case, by it being a numbers game. There were so many infections, I mean, so many billions of people, that you will get vaccines that slip through the immune response and then start to be selected for, despite the fact that, unlike influenza, they don't have a correction method for correcting their DNA for any mistakes. So many infections also results in vaccine evasion from that sort of aspect.
And I do think as well, while I'm criticizing or at least highlighting a certain level of frustration and disappointment with the COVID vaccines, it must be said that they were much more effective at dealing with the problem that they were dealing with than the traditional flu vaccines have been for decades. Yeah. I mean, that's a product category that delivers billions of sales, and half the time it only works half the time. I mean, there's a very, very clunky forecasting mechanism. The WHO releases information on what it thinks are going to be the likely circulating, the most prevalent strains about 6 months in advance, because these old-fashioned egg-based production methods were still the backbone of flu vaccine production systems, and they needed months to get up to scale, so that by the time the flu season kicks off, usually this is done in about February or so, and the vaccines are ready for distribution around September, October. And very often the forecasts may be incorrect, partially correct, and the match between the vaccine and the prevailing strains may be quite poor. And the mRNA technology obviously is much, much more rapid, and one hopes that the immediate kind of gift that the pandemic, if I use the word gift advisedly given the amount of damage it caused, but one positive thing coming out of it will hopefully be an overhaul of our flu vaccine production systems and a shift from the protein-based systems to an mRNA-based system. That would strike me as being a kind of a no-brainer. And what's interesting and historically to note was that there had never been an mRNA vaccine put into a human arm until COVID-19, but there actually had been in, I think, Austria, permission from the regulatory authorities for an mRNA vaccine directed against influenza, and for that trial to get underway. Now, it never got underway because of the pandemic, and that actually was a vaccine developed by CureVac. who were early movers in terms of making noise around developing an mRNA vaccine, to the point that the Trump administration attempted to buy the whole company, but they were very quickly rebuffed. But unfortunately, they've foundered a little bit in terms of trying to get an effective vaccine through clinical trials. But they've made some very, very interesting progress around small scale production, which I think, again, is something that is one of the legacies of COVID, that they call them RNA printers, but I mean, they're not like a desktop printer. They're more like the big yoke that you'd print a newspaper on or something like that. These are large industrial systems, but they're self-enclosed, self-contained, and they can be operated by people who don't necessarily have advanced degrees in chemical engineering. And manufacturing in general, and the extraordinary supply chains that were put together to enable manufacturing of these lipo nanoparticle encapsulated mRNA vaccines. At peak, they were doing billions of doses per year. That was an incredible performance by, let it be said, by the private sector, supported by upfront cash from the public sector. But this was private sector activity, and there was some doubts about whether this was the right way to do it or not. And I think they showed that, yes, it was. I think they really made it happen. And we now know that that production capacity is in place, and there will be further improvements and enhancements to it. But we also need to look at the vaccine technologies per se as well, don't we? I mean, we have mRNA, and it does work, but we need more variety. We need different product features, better thermostability. If you could eliminate cold chain distribution requirements, that would make these vaccines much more easy transportable to low resource environments. And I know they're putting RNA production in various countries on the African continent. For example, Rwanda has done a partnership with, I think, BioNTech. Moderna is doing some work. I cannot remember, is it Kenya they're in? I'm a bit vague about the actual details, but I know that there is moves now to get that mRNA production technology out of the rich north and into a much more globally distributed kind of a setup. But in terms of other modalities, other vaccine technologies, are there any that you think have something to offer, maybe for what if we don't have a once in a generation pandemic and we have another one in our generation? Any thoughts about what you think is going to maybe yield better vaccines, if that's possible?
Well, I think it's difficult. Certainly looking at the efficiency of the mRNA vaccines in the pandemic. That sort of level of efficiency was not seen, as you said, in other vaccines like influenza. And I'd like to touch on a lot of interplay between influenza and COVID-19 if we've got time. But the aspects you talk about is, I mean, I go back in history. I think it was 3 or 4 years. I supervised a master's student who was working at CureVac. And I worked for the commercial director when I was at SmithKline, who then moved to BioNT. So mRNA vaccines back in the day weren't on infectious diseases. They were directed towards cancer, and to give BioNT it's still working on that. And the same things, similar, CureVac was talking about influenza and cancer. And when I first saw Moderna, when it was a private company, there was nothing about respiratory viral vaccines in its presentation. So come the vaccine, and that vaccine is mRNA. Now, it wouldn't be a bad thing. It would be a bad thing for the share prices of particularly BioNT and Moderna if mRNA vaccines were only good at COVID-19 and never branched out from that. And there were too many hurdles with influenza, too much existing infrastructure, too low a price point to make them viable influenza vaccines or combination COVID influenza vaccines. So I don't see it's a bad thing. But the other aspect is that to answer your question, and when you talk to people in CROs, clinical research organizations, people who run clinical studies, and they ran these studies, right? They're still amazed to this day that we got those vaccines, or they got those vaccines through clinical trials and onto the market in about a year or less than a year. And they did this, right? And they're still amazed that they've done that. So I think we should, or the mRNA vaccines should, bask in their reflected glory. And perhaps we shouldn't expect too much from them from here, because it is so difficult to produce a new vaccine. There have been tens of years to get to an RNA, a vaccine to prevent RNA. And then it's a bit like London buses, two come along at once. But of those 50 or 60 years when people have been trying and there were safety problems with the early attempts at RSV vaccines, nothing for years. And then Pfizer and GSK end up with two, and we've got two on the market. But it's taken molecular biology.
Pfizer and Moderna.
And GSK, Pfizer and GSK have approved RSV vaccines.
Oh, sorry, RSV, I misheard you.
Yeah. So it's taken many decades to get approved RSV vaccines, not just in the selection of the antigens you use, but in the other excipients and the adjuvants that allow an immune response to be protective and long lasting. So there's a lot of historical vaccine technology. And it's come up with a whole range of childhood vaccines and adult vaccines and travel vaccines. And yes, in the end, COVID-19 vaccines, and every year an influenza vaccine through different methodologies. To expect another one just to pop out, and that's the other thing that I was hinting at earlier. The vaccines are different to drugs. They're not given to patients, like oncology drugs are given to seriously ill patients in clinical studies in later stages of their disease. Vaccines are given to healthy people. So it's quite different to develop a vaccine than it is a drug. It's got to go through a large number of healthy patients, and it's got to be safe as well as effective. And you've got to find out a dosing regime, how many doses you have over what period and what's the interval between them that's not too onerous and stops people taking them. So I think vaccines have come a long way since smallpox, and you could write a book, Smallpox to COVID, the journey of vaccines, and it's been great. Just think of the lives that would have been saved and the disease that has been prevented. And people look back in the short term at mRNA vaccines and say, well, it only prevents death and serious disease. It doesn't stop people getting COVID-19 respiratory infections. Fine. If that's the most you can get out of a COVID-19 vaccine, then you want to be one of those people whose death is prevented.
Is the industry itself partially to blame for raising expectations unduly? It's a cliche across multiple areas of biotechnology that a company will have this fantastic platform and it's plug and play, or that metaphor from the IT industry. And it's as simple as you swap in and out a cartridge and next minute, bang, you had a COVID vaccine, now you have a flu vaccine, now you have an RSV vaccine. And as you're saying, it is not as simple as that. It's much more complicated. Biology is much more complicated. The companies themselves know it's much more complicated, but it's a kind of a neat way of trying to encapsulate an idea about a platform, about an approach to doing things. But there's so much variation in biology and there's so much heterogeneity in people, be they people who have disease, people who are healthy, people who have underlying conditions, people who have quirks of immunology. Some people did have nasty responses to the vaccine. Yeah. Far less, let it be said, than to the virus, but we can't ignore vaccine-related injury as well.
And as you say, the mRNA vaccines weren't the only vaccines to be produced during the pandemic and to be safely administered to patients. And we forget about the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine and the J&J vaccines, that chimpanzee adenoviruses that have largely slunk away and are now de minimis in sales. I mean, J&J's announcement last week was they're withdrawing any guidance based on their COVID-19 vaccine. So it is its own evolutionary process, all of the technologies that the sector can offer, and it gave us mRNA above everything else. But you're right, because all of those other technologies include some tiny biotechnology companies who even I had never heard of before. And the pandemic comes and they come out of the woodwork saying they've got a new COVID-19 drug that's going to address the pandemic, or a vaccine. And I think our first podcast talked about the reputation of the sector. Now, the sector's reputation has suffered because of that, because it reminded me of snake oil salesmen touring the frontier towns of the Midwest in the 1800s, selling this magic thing that you'd never heard of the biotech company before. You'd never heard their drug before, yet suddenly they were going to be the ones who were going to address the pandemic. And largely, it didn't happen. And lots of shareholders lost money, and that has affected the sector's reputation.
Although you can castigate some of these companies as snake oil salesmen, You can also, though, look at the better ones, if you like, in that category and separate them out completely and say, okay, these are companies with very promising next generation technologies. COVID is a kind of a testing ground or proving ground for early prototype products that may never reach human clinical trials, but that might get into preclinical models, for example, and might therefore yield some funding that will enable them to get the technology to the next stage. Because I did spend some time talking to some of these companies during the pandemic, and obviously they have ideas, and some of it's wishful thinking around, say, cross-strain protection, for example, so that you don't have to go chasing variants, the old cliched way of saying that you're chasing the vaccine and playing catch-up mode because it evolves away from your vaccine. And if you can have these, say, for example, virus-like particles, which are sort of protein nanoparticles that will have representative epitopes, is the technical word for those who are not technically disposed. Epitopes are sort of little subunits or fragments of proteins that actually trigger an immune response, be it an antibody or a cellular immune response. And if you have a sort of a mosaic effect that you can get a very rich immune response to an array of different epitopes, that might induce cross-strain protection so that even your immune system, if it's primed with such a vaccine and it encounters a strain of coronavirus that is never seen before, but that there's enough interesting antibodies and interesting T cells around that they're going to catch it. You're creating kind of an immunological safety net. Though, I mean, those ideas got into early stage research and maybe into animal preclinical studies and never made it to clinical trials. Some of those ideas are still being funded by the American BARDA, the Biomedical Advanced Research and Development Authority. For example, there's a company called Codagenics, which has a live attenuated vaccine delivered intranasally. And they're one example. They've gotten BARDA funding to do a substantial phase 2B clinical trial to look at their particular vaccine. And a live attenuated vaccine obviously could be very potent. It might offer
lifetime protection.
And prevent transmission. And again, I read this very interesting review, though, that came out earlier this summer. A lot of vaccine experts will talk about mucosal immunity and trying to reduce immune responses in the mucosa, the nasal passages and the airways, that if you can immobilize the virus by inducing a strong immune response there, you might even prevent systemic infection and also prevent transmission. And it's long been held out as a kind of a holy grail for vaccinologists. But there's a bunch of scientists from the Pete Doherty Institute for Infection and Immunity in Melbourne, Australia, put out, I thought, a very cogent discussion about the challenges of developing mucosal vaccines for SARS-CoV-2. The subtitle is The Triumph of Hope Over Experience.
You're right, though. I mean, people talk of mucosal immunity, particularly as it applies to respiratory pathogens, be it bacterial or fungi, as the panacea. And you're also right in that I saw Moderna when it was a private company, and I thought it was just some French bloke spending a lot of money. And I commented at the time, largesse is a French word after all. And yes, there were lots of companies that appeared from the cracks during the pandemic, promised a lot, and then disappeared back into the cracks again. But biotechnology, pharmaceutical technology is so advanced these days, you can't tell what's going to come up next. And we did say that it's not easy to develop new vaccines, but they are being developed. And I remember talking to a key opinion leader, it was probably decades ago, about the new pneumococcal streptococcus, or they were in those days, because we were switching between conjugated streptococcal vaccines and polysaccharide. And they'd actually demonstrated, they didn't design this, but they actually demonstrated that the Pfizer Prevnar actually stimulated mucosal immunity, probably because of the nature of the antigen, and therefore prevented pneumococcal disease in large number of patients. So if you could build on that and move forward in targeting mucosal immunity, then potentially that might be a way forward. As I say, it is the panacea for everything, but you also need some systemic immunity as well. You need antibodies and perhaps T cells floating around to give you protection and immunological memory, respectively. But there are lots of aspects still to be determined in terms of vaccine design, vaccine administration, adjuvant use, that could perhaps result in a next generation of vaccines from typically companies that are not vaccine companies today.
And I think we really should feel, when you compare where we were in the darkest times of the pandemic, when fatality rates were just climbing and the vaccines were in clinical trials and people were just waiting on positive news, but everything was going too slow because even though it was going at breakneck speed in terms of how the pharmaceutical industry normally works. But I think we should have very strong grounds to be very optimistic. But I do think it takes very important technology stewardship and investment by the public authorities, and you would hope as well by private capital. Arguably, the people who've made the most money maybe have some sort of duty to humanity to invest some of it in ongoing research, and it could be basic research or technological or translational research. But some people obviously have made huge amounts of money from this horrendous event in our history, and we're very grateful, strong reasons to be grateful to them, and they have benefited humanity massively. And it was nice to see the Nobel Prize, for example, recognizing Katalin Kariko and Drew Weissman earlier this month. So there's a lot to be grateful for and optimistic for, but as well, we know how bad and how much damage a bad pandemic will cause, and the amount of investment involved to improve preparedness, relatively speaking, is peanuts, isn't it?
Yeah, and I think that's an important take-home point, that yes, the pandemic was horrible, and yes, it was fantastic in terms of the time and the speed and everyone pulling together in the industry to bring the vaccines to products to market and generate a population immunity, albeit temporary. But having done it once, you're going to be a lot better doing it again the next time, should another pandemic come along. So, people talk about vaccine pandemic preparedness, and there still are charitable organizations funding different types of vectors and different types of vaccines in order to prepare for the next pandemic. So one of the many good things to come out of the pandemic is that we're better off dealing with the next one.
And let's hope there won't be one. But yeah. Okay. Well, until the next time. Thanks, Andy.
Thanks, Cormac. Cheers, everyone.
Bye, everybody.